So welcome and thank you very much for joining us. I would like to start the conversation very broadly, just to frame the issues against which we will measure the DMRE and others' role in the transition. So what would a just energy transition look like as an ideal, and how would we know if we got there? Lebohang, do you want to start?
Yeah, so this is such a difficult question to respond to, but I think we kind of have to start from where we currently are and, just to ask ourselves if we are happy with the current status quo or the business as usual sort of approach that we're currently in. And if that's not the case, what do we need to do to get us to a better society? And I think that's broadly what the just transition seeks to do. I know I come from the trade union movement, so people think that when we talk about a just transition, we are only narrowing it to a very narrow issue related to ensuring that workers are not displaced, and if they are, there is replacement for them to work in other sectors of society. But that's really a narrow definition. What we really want and the end state that we seek for is an ambitious one. And I think the ambition is important. I know, especially when there was the development of the Just Transition Framework for South Africa, people were saying, well, isn't this a bit wishy-washy and unrealistic? But I really think that it's important for us to rally society around a broad and ambition around a just transition for South Africa. And at the heart of it is really around what the PCC says and I know you've referenced it in your actual study, around just achieving a better quality of life for our citizens. Definitely better than what we're giving them currently. And that's really at the heart of what we want as an end state. We're plagued with a number of issues in our society. 50% of our population is relying on state transfers for their daily sustenance. So in us who are in the policy space, working on crafting this just transition, ideally we want to fix those structural challenges and decarbonize our economy at the same time, and also achieve the imperatives of better air quality, of restoration of our societies. And that, I think, is broadly what we want. We want to eradicate poverty. And people say that's not realistic, but that's at the heart of what the just transition is about, while we are building better societies and we are transforming our economy. Because clearly there's problems in the current state that we're in, and we want a better society for our people. So broadly, that is what we foresee as the vision for a just transition. And I know already you referenced the Presidential Climate Commission definition of a just transition. And why that's important is because this is a definition that was widely consulted upon. Communities that are in fossil fuel intensive areas consulted and agreed to this particular definition. So I think that's really at the heart of what we want as the broad vision for a just transition.
Victor, do you want to come in?
Yes, please. Thank you. I would say, well, I agree with what you're saying. I would say first, how would we know? I think the first thing, if there's a real purposive transition, in other words, that the PCC succeeds in holding a space in which evidence, debate, arguments, agendas of constituencies are all brought to the surface, and that the end result is a result of this purposive transition. So I may warn that maybe, the private sector development of renewable energy is already a signal that the part of work that's supposed to be done in the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan is not being done. And in fact, the DMRE is a custodian of it. Just a quick explanation, maybe. the Renewable Energy Master Plan foresees a whole production chain from mining to renewable energy to even recycling and dismantling at the end of life. And why it's very important is because this whole value chain is necessary to create jobs. But if we have a private sector-led renewable energy build-up, and they import the components, then we don't have a value chain in South Africa. So that's one of the things I think to watch, whether that actually works. And I also think it's one of the things that's under the control of the DMR that they could deal with. But more broadly, this transition is a transition to sustainability and justice, and it's very clearly spelled out in the PCC documentation. So in that, when we arrive to that situation, you will also see the Department of Minerals actually doing proper regulation, because mining will still happen, and promoting energy sources that go beyond coal. So deal with its own very tight connection to the coal economy. So I'll leave it at that, but I think those would be two signs that we've achieved the transition.
Okay, so first I should say that the department was invited to be a panelist with us, but they declined. They have got officials here. Supermanda, welcome. And if the department would like to participate from the floor, we'd really welcome that. I'm going to circle back to this notion of a just transition and the role players in it at the end, sort of broaden the conversation up as we end. But for now, I want to focus in on the findings of the report. Toko, essentially the report, it acknowledges there are multiple role players in an energy transition, let alone a just energy transition. But it says that given the role of this department, now two departments in energy policy and regulation, in ensuring sustainable mining, the report makes the case that the department has a major role to play, but has not stepped up to play that. Toko, can you outline for us what the research identifies as the primary reasons for that, or at least what we feel are some of the primary drivers there? And Victor and Lebo, also after that, you're welcome to chip in with your views on the reports and the findings and pertinent issues to understanding the department's role.
So one of the major findings of the report is that the DMR, we'll just call them DMR, Department of Mineral Resources, because we know now it's been split. The DMR really sees itself as a protector or guardian of, the mining space and previously the energy space. And this view has led to, some policy contestation and political contestation over, what it sees as an encroachment of its responsibilities in the space. And if you go through the report, both implicitly and explicitly, there is that argument that, mining in particular is the backbone of South Africa's economy. But on the other hand, there is this policy contestation between the DMR and other stakeholders as, the DMR does not feel that the just energy transition in its current iteration is inclusive of the Department of Mineral Resources. And most of that is, a political and policy position, which is very complex and quite nuanced, not only for the DMR, but for other stakeholders. And I think we can get into that. But in terms of the institution itself, the DMR appears to have lost a lot of opportunities to act in ways that could have assisted the just energy transition. Why we came to that conclusion is because looking at early legislation, regulations around what the DMR should be doing, it seems as though some opportunities that could have led to a just energy transition simply weren't taken, and it's not clear why that is. So for instance, a lot of the early legislation and regulations of the department refer to sustainable development, refer to environmental management, which I think Victor can speak to. And yet, many of the stakeholders of the department think that it hasn't stepped into that space. So it is just a mining and energy regulator and nothing more than that. So even if the just energy transition is contested and nuanced, and as Victor has said, needs a body to hold space for all stakeholders to agree on what the just energy transition will look like, the DMR can still or should have still been doing things that would have led to a just energy transition. And then the third major finding, which I think is also very important, not only for the DMR, but institutions in the South African context, is that there is an institutional incoherence between what the department presents to its stakeholders, to the public in the policy space, and how it is internally organized. So I don't think the DMRE is fundamentally against an energy transition. It's happening, it's going to happen. And, if we want to be nihilistic about it, it would threaten the very existence of the DMRE, right? But it still has internally units and programs that are geared towards responding to the just energy transition. And we do detail that in the report. So the way that the DMRE is presenting itself publicly and from a policy perspective is very different to what we see within the department, where there is space for climate change policies, IPP policies, energy transition policies, and yet the DMR is not stepping into that space publicly. So I think that besides the policy contestation and the politics around what is a just energy transition in a post-apartheid, post-colonial state, we really need to interrogate how our institutions, such as the DMRE, seem to have this contradiction within them and how they present themselves publicly.
Toko, I'm going to push you a little bit as somebody who knows the report well, to maybe be a little bit more provocative. I mean, in chapter 4 of the report, you make the argument that the department essentially sees itself as protecting a series of vested interests. And, I think that the report is critical of the absence of the department in a way we would like to see it show up, especially given that it has a long-standing mandate in environmental sustainability, irrespective even of the new demands of climate change. But you make a very particular argument around how it sees itself as a custodian of those interests. And essentially, the report is making a twin argument that there's both questions potentially of capacity, and you chart the splitting and re-emergence of the department over time and the effects that has had on institutional capacities. And as students, so to speak, PARI, as students of the public administration, we know how much mergers and demergers affect capacity. But you also make a broader political argument that it is digging in its heels because of the way it sees itself as the custodian of those interests. So can you chat a little bit more about those?
Yes. So, I mean, as I just said a few minutes ago, that the DMRE is going to have to confront an energy transition, whether or not it wants to. And I think it's very aware that this transition is taking place, but it is not participating in ways that it could, or in ways that even its stakeholders think that it should be participating, because it really sees itself as protecting the mining industry, the energy industry from interests that will threaten these sectors in South Africa. This is partly a political position, as I alluded to, because our interactions with the DMRE showed that there is no denial about how South Africa needs, there's no denial that South Africa needs to transition in a just way in terms of energy and in terms of how mining is regulated. But the disagreement or the resistance is to the methodologies, and very precisely whether these methodologies are fair and make sense in our context. But then secondly, how this transition is going to be financed, and the fact that South Africa may not be able to resist some of the financing that would come in from a just energy transition, and therefore, would be difficult to say no to. And so when you look at the financing and the methodology and resisting against that, I think there would be scope to say, okay, if these are the main pillars of resistance, apart from, the political contestation, what does a post-apartheid state look like? How does it develop? Then I think that can open up, or that should open up the DMR to a conversation about how then it does participate, right? Because the financing and the methodologies will always be areas of contestation, but the DMRE needs to step into the space and actively participate in a way that is felt by stakeholders, in a way that is felt by those, let's say, in the mining sector, because there are vested interests there, as you've said, and vested interests is not necessarily negative. It just means that there are people who are tied to the mining industry who would need to be transitioned out in some way. Yeah, let me stop there.
Victor, do you want to give your opinion on that argument? I mean, you've read the report, and I know you felt we could have come out stronger, so I'd be interested to hear your views. That's okay. And then Lebo, I'm going to ask you to.
Well, I mean, I think it's a very important question, and I think historically departments do get attached to their stakeholders, and they do hold a certain space, and they have strong relationships with the actors in that space. But I think this particular department, you point out that it's one of the oldest departments. So South Africa went through a huge, big imperial war to establish itself, and part of in 1910, and part of that was to create, and it's in the literature, was to create a favorable environment for mining, including that it should be regulated. So a lot of this theory is in the minerals energy complex, and it's a colonial complex. It's an extractive colonial complex. So there's a historical reason for a culture of protecting mining, and protecting mining, including its extractive nature. So for me, that's the explanation of the weak regulation of the department in terms of environmental negative externalities. It's not that the department is not competent. So, for example, it's made major progress in terms of safety on mines. So it's able to do it, but it hasn't done the same in terms of regulation of external effects, pollution of communities living next to mines. But I think if we look at such an old history, if we look at the minerals energy complex, there was an understanding between the state and the mining capital that the state would support, it would in some cases subsidize, and it would reap a big tax income that enabled it to actually be a state from 1910 onwards. So I think we need to appreciate the historical depth. It's not just the working culture of a number of people. People, I imagine, enter the department and encounter a tradition and a working culture. That said, I do believe that there are definitely officials in all our departments, including in this department, who can see the future arriving and who can see what is necessary for it. And I noticed in the report how difficult it was to actually get airtime with the department. However, the fact that we do have a report means that people have spoken about it, have shared their thoughts and concerns, and some of them are in the department. So I think we need to support those officials, and we need to make things easier for them, because we all have to go together into this transformation. And you know, we have lots of resources for mining beyond coal, and we will engage with them, and they need to be regulated properly.
Thank you, Lebo.
Yeah, so Victor's kind of covered what I would have wanted to talk to about, basically the political economy of why we find ourselves where we currently are. And a large part of it is because of the mineral energies complex. And it's upon that particular complex that, yes, is extractive, yes, is colonial, that we've built an industrial strategy that does mirror a pre-apartheid dispensation. Yes, there are a few Black industrialists that have emerged, but definitely not enough. And the report talks about this. I think where we find ourselves stuck is that even with all the work that we're doing in terms of mapping and modeling pathways to a low carbon economy, and SAREM tries to do this, but I don't think there is a concerted effort or a consensus and agreement on, yes, a post-apartheid, but a decarbonized industrial strategy for the country. I think it goes a bit beyond. It goes a bit beyond SAREM, where, you know, I think parties within the DMRE can see the opportunity that exists in a post-apartheid industrial strategy for South Africa. I noted in the report that when there were discussions with officials, you know, yes, they recognize that decarbonization is important, but they point a finger at, you know, Western pressures for our decarbonization journey. I mean, that to me in itself tells me that there is a lack of understanding of the issues. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't Western issues that are at play, but domestically there are issues at play as well. South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa warms up at twice the global average. Any infrastructure that we will build now will be washed away. It's already happening in the KZN region. So there are issues related to our ability to develop. If you can't build infrastructure, you can't develop. You develop as fast as you can build your infrastructure. So there are clearly issues even in the report that I look at, and I almost can already see where the problems are. There isn't an appropriate and appreciation for an industrial strategy within the process of decarbonization that does yield benefits for society more broadly. Let's be honest. Other than building or other than creating space for a few Black industrialists, and other than, you know, building up, you know, opportunities for very few conglomerates, the impact and the benefit of mining activities remains concentrated in the hands of a few. And we have an opportunity to diversify those things, but if it is done correctly and managed correctly. So for me, I look at this and I really think that, and I appreciate some of the recommendations that came out of this report, but there really are opportunities that we are passing by not proactively engaging in some of the opportunities that can emerge again in a post-apartheid industrial strategy.
I'm actually going to, given that you're speaking again about the broader sort of questions of the political economy, I'm going to jump to the last set of questions that I was going to end with. I mean, how do we build consensus for a just transition? You know, I sat yesterday just reading online, and I was consciously trawling the range of opinions and debates on the just energy transition. And it strikes me that often there are detailed technical conversations, and the fact that they require so many detailed technical conversations makes it hard for a broader public to engage sometimes, I think. But often disagreements around questions of the right energy mix, or around the path to an energy transition, or around a path to a just energy transition, reflect ideological differences and debates around appropriate models of development, right? They reflect differing views on how, in any sector, how much the private sector should be involved, whether it should be private sector driven or not. And it strikes me that the demand for us to deal with the acute climate crisis and the need to transition has arrived at a moment in our history where we have forgotten how to debate economic policy. And because of the state capture years, in a way, our conversation about corruption and our concerns around governance in a functioning state displaced what were at some point far richer discussion about economic policy. So, if we are to use the moment of transition to renewable energy from coal-based economies, we need, for example, the DTIC's capacities to step up, to enhance. And it strikes me that, we've reached the need to address this at the very moment that we don't have a plan. And if you look at the Government of National Unity, by necessity, it's a grand coalition, the sort of statement of intent, the comments on economic policy are enormously broadly, abstractly stated, understandably. So Victor, I'm going to go to you first, and then you, Lebo, your views. Who else do we need to bring into this conversation? Let's put the department there for a second. The DTIC's capacities, how we regulate the economy, the National Treasury, etc. Victor?
Thank you very much. I'm going to just start off by picking up what you said about the economic debate. South Africa has a wonderfully rich history, intellectual history, of debating the political economy. We have a vocabulary, but we have an experience of it and so on. In fact, over the past 30 years, there are many other legacies that have built up, ways of doing things. We've invented lots of things. We've written wonderful policy papers. Things have also happened in reality. And I think this history of this ability to talk about the political economy coincides with a very important truth that comes out of climate change debates. And that truth is that capitalism is a major cause of climate change. And the reason for that is that the pursuit of profit in a single dimension makes it impossible to properly plan how to use resources, how to conserve environments, and how to have a just economic system. So we do face a very big challenge, and it's a challenge of, I would say, I'll go freelancing a bit, but I would say the challenge for the owners of capital and the people, the people who support capitalism and make it work on a daily basis, is to think about a new economy, to take that step. And I think for people on the left to come out of this tradition of political economy is to start looking at all the alternatives, including the softening of capitalism. I think it'll throw all of us into a very uncertain space, but it's a very, very urgent debate. We should come into it open-minded, but we should also come into it with the rich resources of the past. So I think it's a very urgent debate, and I do not think climate change or the transition can be properly handled without serious attention to this debate.
I mean, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. In the just transition framework for South Africa, we talk about restorative justice. We talk about distributive justice. So previous transitions, and they'll continue to come and go, they have a habit of creating very few winners and a truckload of losers. And I think if we are ever going to achieve a transition that is just, we need to address that. So the just transition is so conflicted. It's doing two things at the same time. It's addressing historical issues, so our apartheid legacy. It's addressing our future and trying to do that all at the same time. Now that is a difficult task. And I know the conversation today is around the DMRE, but like you've said, it requires a broad set of stakeholders. Yes, and a leader in those conversations has to emerge. Currently, it seems as though the presidency takes on that role. But within departments, it would be good if a clear leader emerged to drive that process forward. So it requires, and I don't think you're going to do this without adopting a whole of society approach, which is difficult. It's difficult to do because, you know, we always argue in the Presidential Climate Commission, what is sufficient consensus? How many people must I have talked to have really gotten the views of society? But it's an effort. It's an effort nonetheless that we must strive to achieve. So, you know, we talk to people in the financial industry and talk about the fact that your current financial mechanisms are not sufficient for a just transition. If you can't give funding to a startup to fail a couple of times, we unfortunately can't achieve a just transition, because if funding is going to flow in the hands where it's historically flowed, that is not a just transition. So we have to have a broad array of conversations and concessions. And this is what we mean by distributive justice. Both wins and losses must be borne by all of us equally. So that's the difficult conversation, Victor, with the capitalists. I tried in the trade union movement for a good 7 years, but we don't give up. But I think those are the conversations that we honestly need to have. The ownership patterns in our country are unsustainable. They're completely unsustainable.
If I can just add a bit, I think we must realize our context. We are in very deep trouble. We have a 60% unemployment rate for youth. That is our future. And at the same time, climate change has passed the critical 1.5 degrees Celsius mark, which means we cannot even predict what all the impacts are going to be. But we can say with certainty it'll become more difficult to live on this planet. So it's not as if this is an intellectual conversation for our own enjoyment. We are in a crisis situation. There's a climate crisis and there's a justice crisis in our society. So we need to take urgent action, and so I would say we need to take it. I agree with this all of society approach, an inclusive approach, but that means that we need to listen to each other. We need to listen to things we're not comfortable with, and we need to go boldly into the future, which after all is a South African characteristic.
Can I add to that,
Yes,
Sarah?
yeah.
I mean, I think coming back to the report and everything we've learned along the way, given the longer history, but also the immediate history that you touched on and the state capture years, I think the DMR needs to re-establish trust with stakeholders in order to have that honest conversation. It's clear that there is a conversation going on in the DMR. based on our interactions. We might not agree with that conversation. There might be policy contestation. But if you don't reestablish trust by showing up to some of these engagements with communities, with the PCC, with other stakeholders, how do we get to that honest conversation? And so I think a very clear pointer here is that the DMR needs to reestablish trust and needs to come into those spaces so that that conversation can be had, because without that, there will be no movement on the part of the mining industry, at least.
I think, PARI's broader kind of findings and research on the state, our senses over the last, we're nearly 15 next year, the state has become increasingly laggard. And I think that it has done so partly as a reaction to the state capture years. I think that being an official is sometimes a risky, you work in risk as an official. And I think that partly in that context, and now faced with an even more acute set of challenges that the state, and not only the state, but we're talking about the state right now, needs to address, it has turned in on itself even more. And it's understandable, yet at the same time, if it creates more risk for itself in not being able to reach out to stakeholders and generate those kinds of embedded ties with other actors in this space. And I mean, I think that there's a whole section in the report where you talk about the sort of information blackout and, recommend to the department that it has to start working on building those risky, difficult, politically uncomfortable engagement with stakeholders in mining affected communities, environmental, NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. I don't really want to say any more. And then I want to turn to the question of the splitting of the department.
Thanks, Sarah. So yes, I think, and again, this ties in the information blackout, ties into the institutional incoherence. So just to give an example to our audience, a lot of stakeholders complain at different levels that the DMR will show up for engagements and, whether it's in mining communities or, policy engagements, and really not say anything or actively participate in, those discussions, which is, it's worrying because you want to know who's in the room when these important things are being discussed. Firstly, just, at a basic level of trust. But secondly, to show up and not participate is part of the problem of resistance that is being faced, by stakeholders of the DMR. And so, that information blackout, although it has, different forms, whether it's not responding, not picking up the phone, not engaging, creates, like you say, a real lager. And yet, within the DMR, there is a stakeholder management unit, which I think is characteristic of a lot of departments and institutions in South Africa. So it's not like there isn't that knowledge or ability. We can argue about capacity, but the way it presents itself versus what it could be doing, which is so much more, even just to comment and say, maybe this is how far the IRP is, why it's being delayed, why we're having disputes over the energy mix, etc., would go way further in those discussions and those engagements than what we're currently experiencing with the DMR. So the information blackout, again, ties into, how the institution is behaving in contradictory ways.
Okay, so I'm now going to talk to the question of the splitting of the department. The report, well, we were in the midst of finalizing the report when the announcement about the cabinet and the future of the department was announced, and we had to furiously rewrite a few paragraphs. We had recommended that the department should be split. Obviously, the role of mining in our economy and energy, has always, for so long, has been closely tied to the mining sector. We identified, and many other people in the sectors have spoken about, a conflict of interest inherent in the design, of the department of having both. And I think that it wasn't always a conflict of interest. It wasn't 100 years ago because it was the raison d'etre in a way of that energy department originally. But clearly, it sort of to lead on a renewable energies change at the same time to provide support to the mining industry. Increasingly, our sense was that this was a conflict of interest. Victor and Lebo, do you think that this is progress? Do you think it's good that it's been split for the officials? I know that it comes with enormous anxiety and the sheer effort of restructuring the department shouldn't be, I think, underappreciated. But do you think this was the right move? Do you think there's potential here? And what other potential do you see for the next term of the administration in getting better movement and far quicker movement that we urgently need on the energy transition? Lebo, do you want to start?
I'll start. Yeah, it's a good move. You explained it's almost kind of counterintuitive when you look at it now, when you put together sort of like the mining aspect and then energy together. 100 years ago, absolutely, it worked. You mine the coal, you go and you burn and you create the energy. So that's okay. So it is a bit of a conflict, like it's stated in the report as well, and it does create a bit of a tension, I guess. So there definitely is an opportunity for there to be a focus, because mining, by the way, is not a sunset industry, even in our transition to a low carbon economy. Through the mining of critical minerals, there are huge opportunities that exist. And maybe it's a really good thing that there will be a department that is now focused on just that. And then, yes, definitely with the split of and the focus on a sole department for energy, I think could really be a good initiative. Also, especially when we look at the IRP process, I think it could help us in terms of the IRP process. So the idea behind the IRP is that after 2 years, we should have a new IRP, because really the developments when it comes to energy, especially now, are really quite fast. So it makes sense to review our IRP every 2 years, especially if we want to take into the consideration the decline in cost of certain technologies, especially when we come and look at how we conceptualize least cost. So I think in that sense, just having this department that looks solely at energy will help us at least to achieve that. And we have a minister that's really energetic. I mean, I was watching the seminar earlier on today. So I think that's progress. That definitely takes us forward. And I think as a recommendation, I think it's a progressive way to take us forward.
I agree. I think it's very good that there's a Department of Energy. Step one is stepping away from coal, because basically we sort of separating the coal system from the electricity system fundamentally. But step two for the energy department is also going to be really important. After having taken up residence in the mining department, energy has to now really, energy planners have to take a really broad view, because it's energy that's at the heart of this transition. So we can't have a narrow energy planning. We need to have an energy planning that takes the whole of society into account, social issues, access, affordability, what people can do with it, what is the small business potential of making energy available, what are the gender implications of our energy policies, what are the environmental implications. So I'm looking forward to a Department of Energy that's truly broad-minded and that has truly, stepped into a new space which is a very inclusive one, and because of these complexities and all these connections, it'll be very important for this new department to engage with society as a whole, to have a very proactive engagement strategy and consultation and dialogues and so on, because it's going to last for a while. This transition is not going to be over in 10 years. It'll take longer than that. So there's an exciting future for this new department, and we're cheering them on.
Thoko, I'm going to end off now because I want to open to the floor. Questions online and in the room. Is there anything you want to end off with? Recommendations in the report or just last comments?
One observation that we have is that even with the criticisms of the DMR, a lot of stakeholders are quite sympathetic towards the DMR. And I think it needs to use that opportunity, especially now that it has that, more singular focus of mineral resources and petroleum. No matter how critical, angry, upset, confused stakeholders are of, the DMR and the way that it behaves, there is still sympathy towards what the department can achieve. And I think that leaves the door open to, as I said, reestablishing trust and having that honest conversation. So much as we're critical of the DMR, to those online and in the room, I think what we would recommend overall is that they take the opportunity that they're being presented with, where stakeholders are really willing to work with them, but just cannot understand how they're going to do so. There is an open door.